One British road tester in 1965 tried 3 different sentences to describe the Renault 16 and abandoned every single one. He wasn't stalling, the shape sitting in his driveway simply had no name yet. Half saloon, half wagon, wholly confusing, at least until you drove it. Renault had quietly built the first true hatchback anyone could buy, months before that term ever reached print. Confusion like that has a cause, not a coincidence. Somewhere inside a French design studio, an entire vocabulary was about to get rewritten. Guess which decade the word hatchback actually entered common use? Drop your guess below. Records inside Renault's own archives trace this story back further than most viewers expect, to a car nobody today remembers, a saloon called the Fiat. Renault built it through the 1950s, and it never quite worked. Sales stayed modest. Reliability complaints piled up faster than the company could answer them. By 1960, executives in Paris understood something uncomfortable. Their flagship family car was quietly becoming an embarrassment. An idea started circulating around that same period, and it had nothing to do with fixing the Fiat at all. What if the whole category needed rethinking, not just one model inside it? Pierre Dreyfus ran Renault at the time, and he approved a brief that read almost like a dare. Build a car that behaved like a saloon on the motorway, hauled cargo like a wagon on the weekend, and still looked like neither. Engineers inside the company had never been handed a target this vague or this stubborn. 2 years of prototypes followed, most of them scrapped, a few of them promising enough to keep funded. By late 1964, one shape had survived every internal argument. A 5-door body with a rear hatch instead of a separate boot, wrapped around mechanics nobody outside Renault had tested at this scale before. A brand new factory rose specifically to build this car, a plant at Sandouville near Le Havre with no other purpose written into its blueprints. Renault wasn't hedging. Betting a purpose-built factory on a car nobody had agreed how to categorize meant there was no quiet way to walk the project back, not once ground had already broken. January 5, 1965. Journalists gathered on the Côte d'Azur for the car's first press showing, and reactions split almost immediately. Some praised the styling. Others struggled to even categorize it, unsure whether they were looking at a saloon, a wagon, or something else entirely. That confusion followed the car straight into its public debut at the Geneva Motor Show a few months later. Underneath all that confusion sat an engineering decision most buyers never noticed, and few reviewers fully explained. Renault's torsion bar suspension needed specific geometry to work properly, and that geometry demanded something unusual. The left wheelbase measured 70 millimeters longer than the right. Symmetry, on this car, had simply been sacrificed for ride quality. Picture an engineer explaining that detail to a nervous board member in 1964, watching the number land badly in a room that expected clean, matching dimensions on both sides of a production car. Nobody at a rival manufacturer was building anything this deliberately lopsided. Renault's own suspension team argued the trade-off was worth it, and results from early testing backed them up. Ride comfort over broken pavement improved noticeably, smooth enough that testers reportedly struggled to find fault with a chassis built on such an odd foundation. Mounting the engine mattered just as much. Rather than sitting the traditional way, in front of the gearbox, Renault's engineers placed it behind instead, a layout borrowed loosely from lessons learned on the smaller Renault 4. That single choice freed up space at the nose of the car, shortened the front overhang, and gave the whole design a low, purposeful stance nobody expected from a family saloon. Committee consensus had nothing to do with any of these choices. Each one meant defending an unfamiliar decision to executives who had every reason to play it safe after the Fiat's disappointing run. Betting on an unnamed body style, an asymmetric chassis, and a reversed engine layout all at once looked, from certain angles, like professional suicide. 6 months after that press event, the gamble stopped looking risky. Reviewers who once struggled to classify the car started praising exactly what made it hard to classify: The practicality, the ride, the flexibility no traditional saloon could match. What nobody in that Geneva crowd fully grasped yet was how far this design would eventually travel, or how loudly the rest of the industry would end up borrowing from it. Word of that early praise reached Renault's rivals fast. What they did next revealed exactly how seriously, or how dismissively, Europe's biggest manufacturers were still taking a five-door family car nobody could quite name. Some of Renault's rivals dismissed the five-door layout outright, at least in public. Executives at competing French manufacturers reportedly called it a compromise dressed up as innovation, neither a proper saloon nor a serious wagon. Behind closed doors, several of those same companies quietly ordered a Renault 16 anyway, sent straight to their own engineering departments for a very thorough teardown. Peugeot's own engineers filed an internal report after their teardown, noting the packaging solutions with what one translated memo called grudging respect. Renault's competitors weren't just watching from a distance anymore. They were taking notes. Inside a French household in 1966, none of that boardroom skepticism mattered much. What mattered was a rear seat that folded almost completely flat, turning a cramped family saloon into something that could swallow a mattress, a bicycle, or a week's worth of holiday luggage without a second trip to the roof rack. Buyers who'd spent years wrestling suitcases into a narrow boot suddenly had a car that simply opened up. Renault's designers had placed the gear shift on the steering column rather than the floor, a decision that freed up space across the front bench and let three adults sit shoulder to shoulder without fighting a lever between their knees. Small choices like that rarely make headlines. They make a car easier to live with every single day, which mattered more to an ordinary buyer than any number on a spec sheet. Test drivers noted something else too. That torsion bar suspension, the one built around an oddly asymmetric chassis, delivered a ride quality closer to a much larger, far more expensive car. Potholes that jolted a Peugeot barely registered inside a Renault 16. Reviewers who'd mocked the styling months earlier found themselves quietly recommending the car to friends shopping for something practical. Small business owners noticed the practicality fastest of all. A grocer in Lyon reportedly used his Renault 16 to run deliveries all week, then folded the seats flat on Sunday and drove his family to the coast in the same car. Nothing else in Renault's lineup, or in most rivals' lineups, could switch roles that easily between a Tuesday morning and a Saturday afternoon. Certain critics early on dismissed the whole approach as a car designed by committee rather than by instinct. Too many compromises stitched into one shape to truly excel at anything. Those same critics went quiet once sales figures started arriving from dealerships across France, then Belgium, then well beyond either border. One detail from Renault's own sales record still surprises collectors today. Within its first 18 months, waiting lists in several French cities stretched past 4 months, an eternity for a company that had just watched its previous flagship struggle to sell at all. If forgotten engineering stories like this keep you here, subscribing means you won't miss the next one we dig up. Word crossed the Channel and the Rhine fast. British buyers, used to boxy saloons and stiff, no-nonsense suspensions, found themselves genuinely startled by how composed the Renault 16 felt on rough back roads. German testers, notoriously hard to impress with anything wearing a French badge, admitted the ride and the packaging both beat what their own manufacturers were currently offering at a similar price. Owner reviews and dealership gossip couldn't contain that enthusiasm for long. By late 1965, a jury of European motoring journalists had started comparing the Renault 16 seriously against every other new model launched that year, weighing ride, innovation, and practicality rather than raw performance alone. Late in 1965, the vote came back. Renault's oddly shaped, hard-to-classify family car had won European Car of the Year, beating out saloons and sports cars built by manufacturers with far deeper motorsport pedigrees. It was only the third year the award had existed. No French car had ever won it before. That trophy validated everything Pierre Dreyfus had gambled on 3 years earlier: the unnamed body style, the lopsided chassis, the reversed engine. What none of the judges standing on that stage fully understood yet was how far this shape was about to travel, or how many other manufacturers would eventually build their own version of exactly this idea. 10 years after that Geneva unveiling, an entirely different kind of proof arrived, and it came from Germany. Volkswagen launched the Golf in 1974, a compact five-door hatchback that would go on to define an entire generation of family transport across Europe. Engineers there never publicly credited Renault. The shape did the talking anyway. Britain followed a similar path. Austin's Maxi arrived in 1969, wearing a five-door layout eerily close to what Renault had already proven on French roads 4 years earlier. Ford's Fiesta came later still, launching in 1977 with the same folding rear bench, the same practical hatch, the same basic promise Renault had made to skeptical buyers over a decade before. Italy joined in too. Fiat's 127 launched in 1971, and Peugeot answered with its own 104 a year later. Neither company borrowed Renault's exact engineering, the reversed engine, the asymmetric chassis. None of that survived the translation. What did survive was the fundamental idea, a family car that opened from the back, swallowed cargo whole, and refused to choose between saloon and wagon. By the time Chrysler launched its own Alpine and Horizon models in the mid-1970s, that five-door layout had stopped looking experimental altogether. It had become, quietly and almost without anyone formally announcing it, the default shape for an entire category of European family cars. Rover's SD1 adopted the same idea in 1976, wrapping a hatchback rear end around a car aimed at a completely different price bracket. Opel followed too, badging its own version the Cadet City that same year. 9 years after Renault's awkward Côte d'Azur debut, a body style once too strange to name had become fashionable enough for a dozen manufacturers to copy within a single decade. Somewhere during that stretch, the word finally caught up to the shape. Hatchback entered everyday language sometime within that same decade, used casually by buyers, dealers, and journalists who no longer needed 3 confused sentences to describe what they were looking at. The very confusion that opened this story had quietly resolved itself, one competitor's copycat model at a time. Here's the detail most retrospectives skip entirely. Renault itself kept building the 16 through all of this, largely unchanged in its fundamentals, while an entire industry assembled around a shape it had introduced first. Production finally ended in 1980, 15 years after that awkward press briefing on the Côte d'Azur. Nearly 1.85 million examples had left Renault's factories by then, most of them in a body style that, for its first several years on sale, didn't even have an agreed name. Compare that number against what came after. Volkswagen alone would eventually sell tens of millions of Golfs across 7 generations, dwarfing Renault's own production run many times over. Every one of those later totals traces straight back to the groundwork Renault laid first, on a chassis nobody else had been willing to build. Most drivers today can name the Golf without hesitation. Fewer can name the car that convinced an entire industry the shape was worth stealing in the first place. That's not really a scandal. It's just how influence usually works. The original gets folded into everything that copied it, until barely anyone remembers there was ever an original to credit. Ask a Volkswagen engineer today where the modern hatchback came from, and Wolfsburg's own name usually comes up before Renault's does. That's not exactly dishonest. It's just incomplete, the way most origin stories get flattened once an idea becomes common enough that nobody remembers needing to invent it in the first place. Collectors who search for a clean, rust-free Renault 16 today often describe the same frustration. Plenty of buyers know the name, almost nobody remembers what it actually did first. A handful of restored examples still turn up at European classic car shows each year, parked quietly a few rows away from the Golf that eventually eclipsed it entirely. The Renault 16 didn't just survive its own identity crisis. It ended it for the entire industry, one 5-door copycat at a time, until the shape that once needed 3 confused sentences to describe became the single most ordinary silhouette on European roads. That British road tester never got his neat one-sentence description, The car simply refused to fit inside one. Decades later, it's still shaping every hatchback badge on the road. Which forgotten original should we uncover next? Tell us below, and subscribe before the next one disappears from memory.